Okay, I think we're going to kick off. Babak, ready?
Ready.
We have a great topic today. Thank you all for being here, by the way. It's wonderful to have you, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us today. So we have a good topic today. The topic is zero trust, basically, and joining me today is uh, Babak Pasdar, and anyway, I'm Steve Roesing, President and CEO of ASMGi. Uh, we're a global provider of AI, IoT, IT services, OT, security, and software development. Um, Babak, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me, Steve. Uh, I've spent the last 20 some odd years of my career building large scale global network and security infrastructures, especially with an emphasis on delivering security as a utility. Acreto is my third startup. The last two were acquired by companies like ePlus and Fortinet. My last company is now the Fortinet 40 SASE product. We started Acreto. We built the Acreto platform in order to focus on solving delivery of security for how organizations work today versus the traditional security models, especially around end-to-end security for hybrid infrastructures and distributed infrastructures, and especially around IoT and OT technologies, securing the insecurable, so to speak.
Awesome. Great to have you, and I appreciate your wisdom. So, what are we going to talk about today? Today, we're going to talk about zero trust in general, as I mentioned. We'll talk a little bit about history and the components of zero trust and make sure you understand the concept. And then we'll talk about the components of zero trust architecture. And we're going to go through some case studies. We'll talk about some benefits and challenges. And you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in and get started. So zero trust, it's a pretty popular model, um, but in my experience, it's misunderstood by pretty much everybody, right? And so this slide is about the size of the zero trust market, and as you mentioned something earlier, Babak, that about the current model for security is different than the legacy model or the old model, and the old model could be thought of as perimeter based, right? So enterprises used to have a clearly defined perimeter, and they basically put a firewall in to protect the organization. And today that won't really work. There are a lot of technologies that are moving people out. COVID happened, and a lot of workforces are working remotely and cloud. All of those things add up to zero trust, basically. The size of the market, 23 billion in 2023, will become 129 or 130 billion in 2032. So it's pretty significant growth. We're going to talk a little bit about microsegmentation. I thought this would be an opportunity for you to elaborate a little bit more, Babak, on your platform and what it will do. But microsegmentation is one of the concepts in zero trust, and it basically means you have to microsegment everything, right? So this is to combat specifics of attack vectors or attack methodologies where people get into your network and then they move laterally. For example, segmentation will combat that. I think this graphic shows next gen firewalls. Um, so one of the questions I thought about was, what's the difference between a next gen firewall and a traditional firewall, right? So anyhow, those are the types of things that I came up with, and I think you at Acreto take it a bit further than that, and so maybe you can explain that a little bit, Babak.
Yeah, no, thank you. As you mentioned, Steve, one of the challenges today is that the way organizations work, the way they operate is completely different than it was even a few years ago. You have a much more distributed mode of operation, a la COVID, and remote users. You have cloud and SaaS that have entered their way and have become an integral part of anybody's infrastructure. And you have IoT and OT that have become an embedded component of almost every infrastructure. The traditional security model really emphasizes the Linux, Windows, Mac approach to the technology. It really emphasizes embedding itself in line with networks that organizations control. And it's created a challenge in that you have to have many products from many vendors that do very granular things in order to secure your distributed infrastructure. And not only is that expensive, so much so that a lot of organizations just can't afford to get all of the tools that they need, but it creates complexity, and complexity is the enemy of security. So this new paradigm requires not just something that's more in tune with how distributed and how diverse the technologies are, but it needs to be simpler, more agile, and more robust, none of which are attributes that really you can associate with the traditional approach to security. So this is where this new paradigm comes in. And part of it with zero trust is that you have to start to isolate users, devices, systems, and applications that need to interoperate. And everybody else needs to be completely blind to that these assets exist. So the assets that need to interoperate need to be able to communicate and connect, albeit in a controlled fashion. Everything else needs to not even know that they exist. And this is a level of complexity that if you try to apply it with traditional security, it's going to just people's heads are going to implode. You need a quantum computer to just keep track of all the permutations of all the technologies and all the places with all the levels of access. So this is what calls for a different model. And the model Acreto has developed, we call ICIP, identify, connect, isolate, and protect. But to put much more simply, it's called connect and protect. And this model is really focused on creating a level of simplicity where it does not matter what your technology is. It doesn't matter where your technologies are. It doesn't matter what networks they're connected to. It doesn't matter who owns it or operates it or benefits from it. You have one platform that, with a very simple model, can deliver that security functionality and isolation functionality. And this is where ICIP comes in. ICIP stands for we identify an asset. C is for connect. If it's identified and authorized, it is allowed to connect. Upon connection, it is immediately isolated. Again, regardless of what it is. So think of it every bit as much as a HVAC system or elevator control or a IOMD, Internet of Medical Devices, along with Linux, Windows, Mac servers and clouds. Once it's isolated, then there's full stack security that is applied that includes access control, application control, content control, and full inline threat prevention.
Awesome. Sounds like quite an ordeal, but a good deal for the customers.
Well, all of it has to be very simple to deploy. And this is the beauty of Connect and Protect, because you don't have to build infrastructure. You just connect to it regardless of what your technology is. And not only are all the security functionalities and isolation and segmentation immediately available, but they're immediately applied.
Awesome. I wanted to walk through a timeline of zero trust a little bit, but one of the warnings that I will state is that, like, it's the timelines include disparity, right? So there are tons of resources on the web, and they're a little bit different. But we'll go through it anyway. I think this is pretty representative, but in 2004, so zero trust is 2 decades old already, right? So that's something to understand, right? It just started getting a lot of traction and wheels, I'll say, but it's 2 decades old. It's been around for a long time. So the core premise for zero trust are 3 principles, basically. Terminate connections, terminate every connection, protect data using granular context-bound policies, and reduce risk by eliminating the attack surface. And so I'll say from that perspective, it sounds easy, but it is not easy to implement. Or it can be easy if you use the Acreto platform. But from a history standpoint, so prior to 2004, was the perimeter based. In 2004, the Jericho Forum coined a term called deperimeterization, which is basically eliminating the perimeter in enterprise models. And that's the paradigm I think that we're in now. So in 2009, well, this timeline says 2009. Some of the information that I found says 2010, but in any event, Forrester coined the term zero trust around that time, right? 2009, 2010-ish. In 2014, Google publishes BeyondCorp. In 2011, they actually developed BeyondCorp as an internal initiative. So I would say probably less public information was available at that point. So anyway, in 2014, they published that BeyondCorp exercise. And in 2015, the technology vendors just blew up, right? It started to explode around this. In 2017, Forrester's credited with releasing ZTX. The one source of information that I found says it happened in 2018, but I would say that's about the same time frame. In 2017, Gartner also released CARTA, which is continuous adaptive risk model. Anyway, it's in 2019, NIST published Zero Trust Draft 2017 800-207. Anyway, one source says that actually happened in 2017, so or 2018, so maybe whatever. It's close enough, close enough counts in this case. Um, and that brings us up to modern technology, and we know that a lot of things happened uh, in from 2020 onward, right? In 2021, the president released an executive order around protecting the nation's cybersecurity, which really highlighted zero trust. And the government has said basically that they're going to be the leaders in zero trust. Um, so yet to be determined, I think from that perspective. In 2018, one of the things that was released was the ZTX um, concept, and that's really around an extended model, and they released 7 pillars that were related to zero trust as part of that model, and I was just going to go through those real quick. So number one and number two, workforce security and device security, are really around identifying and authenticating. So anything that connects to your network has to be authenticated, right? So, but it first has to be identified in order to be authenticated. So I think this is misunderstood sometimes, right? You have to identify the assets that you have. And most of the enterprises that I've interacted with have a challenge because people are plugging things into the network and not telling them, right? And not telling anybody. And anyway, it's a real challenge. First, you have to identify, and then you have to authenticate. Item number three, workload security, is about really is about the applications. Um, Network security is where you drill into microsegmentation and segmenting things appropriately so that you can't have lateral movement and those types of things. Data security, like it sounds, is about protecting your data, right? So, and I think first you have to categorize it and know what you have, and then people have talked about a data flow diagram for years, and I think it's critically important as part of this framework to have a data flow diagram. Whoops, I'm sorry. So, item number 6 and 7, visibility and analytics. Item number 6 is really about monitoring and creating visibility to those things that are going on, and automation and orchestration is really about like doing it right. So I wanted to highlight a little bit about the steps required to build a zero trust network. Step number 1 is identifying the users and the devices that are accessing your network, and that in itself can be challenging sometimes, but anyway. Step number 2 is setting up access controls. So the premise of zero trust is when I started in security, it used to be, the saying used to be trust but verify, and then the saying has become don't trust anybody or anything, right? And so zero trust is really about not trusting, just like the name implies, right? A zero trust. Anyway, it's about not trusting and identifying everything that connects to your network. And the premise goes on to say, if you do those things well, you'll have less security risk. But deploy tools to continuously monitor the network. I think from a monitoring standpoint. So access controls is a little bit complex, or can be complex, despite efforts to simplify. Anyway, it has to be monitored to know if somebody gets in that isn't supposed to get in, right? Or something gets in that isn't supposed to get in. And the other part of that is to evaluate remote access. Anyway, I was going to ask um, Babak some questions, and we're going to move into that segment of the webinar now. So the first question is, what are the key components of Zero Trust, and what is the Zero Trust architecture?
I want to touch on one of the points you made earlier. Zero Trust is a 20-year-old model, right? From a concept perspective. Usually in cybersecurity, things move a lot faster than that. You go from concept to saturated deployment, usually within a handful of years, 2, 3, 4 years. After 20 years, you only have 30 some odd% market saturation. So this really speaks to the complexity of Zero Trust to deploy and how ill-suited the traditional approaches to cybersecurity are to support the deployment of Zero Trust. And that's because historically in cybersecurity, everybody's associated a function with a tool, right? I buy this tool to do this, and I buy this tool to do this, and I buy this other tool to do this. Well, to the point here, what are the components of Zero Trust? Well, all of your tools have to come together and work cohesively and seamlessly. Well, individual tools just don't do that. They are not designed that way. They have individual management interfaces. They operate in different ways. Even the same brand of tool and even the same product functionality that you deploy in the office versus in the cloud versus for a remote user versus for a server versus a desktop, they all function very, very differently. So this poses the challenge. So the components of Zero Trust are to isolate assets individually. Right now, there's a big, heavy emphasis on isolation of access to applications and data sets because securing everything is incredibly challenging, but it should be per individual asset isolation once they are identified so that only users, devices, systems, and applications that need to interoperate can interoperate. And then once they're authorized to have access to the attack surface, and once the perspective of the communication or the direction of flow to communication has been defined, then implementing controls, access controls by user, by device, implementing application controls. That is one of the key ways we have been most successful in mitigating ransomware. As a matter of fact, cyber insurance companies are now mandating our platform for high-risk customers. And the number one way we actually mitigate the propagation of ransomware and have been effective in taking their 70+% loss ratio for high-risk customers and bringing it down to 0 for the past 3 years has been by identifying only the authorized application protocols and application programs that are allowed and nothing else. So it doesn't matter if they're communicating on the same port and protocol. Ultimately, ransomware can leverage network protocols and ports, but it cannot emulate application programs. So that's been a very effective method. And then implementing content controls and full inline threat prevention. So the components are, you need to be able to isolate individual assets. You need to be able to identify assets that are authorized and eliminate any access from anything that isn't authorized, that includes both users and devices, and then be able to implement end-to-end controls around the access, around applications, around content, and then deliver full inline threat prevention.
Awesome. So I think a model would be like if somebody doesn't belong on a network or something doesn't belong on a network, you would identify that quickly that they were on the network, and you would isolate further, right? Or get them off.
You shouldn't even need to mitigate, because if they're not allowed, they don't even know your infrastructure exists. If they are allowed, then they're allowed to do very, very specific things that are managed and monitored automatically and enforced.
Awesome. So as we talk about use cases specifically in different verticals, I thought it would be appropriate to identify what ZTNA is, Zero Trust Network Access, versus ZTA, a Zero Trust Architecture. And ZTNA came about in 2019 when Gartner introduced the term. The difference between that and the architecture is in my opinion, right? The architecture implies that zero trust is going to be a portion of it, and ZTNA is a specific. So ZTNA ends up being a subset of ZTA, basically. Is that correct?
Yeah, to be honest with you, Steve, sometimes I get confused by all the buzzwords that are out there, and analysts that come up with their own terminology and phraseology. At the end of the day, from our perspective, it's all about outcomes, right? And the outcomes are very, very specific, very, very clear. Are assets that should be able to interoperate. If they're not, then they shouldn't even know you exist. And then you have to define what that level of interoperation is by user and by device and by application. And then implement a set of controls that can be consistently and reliably applied. And moreover, not rely on people-driven processes to effectuate all of this. And this is where the failure of the traditional security model is. It relies on your processes, or relies on the individual whims of your different security practitioners to implement things, and that is a formula for failure. So it needs to be systematic, it needs to be automatic, and all of these functionalities need to be inherent to the platform. It shouldn't require people to drive these things individually and on a one-off basis. It should be inherent to the platform, so you have consistency in results.
Do you have any specific use cases in different verticals that you can talk about, Babak?
Sure. How much time do you have? Let's talk about government. Local and state government found themselves in a very unique situation with COVID, where they had to all of a sudden start operating distributed when they were inherently all going into offices and the city halls, the state buildings, and so on and so forth. The instances in case a ransomware shot through the roof with this model. So this is, and especially as they had to jerry-rig things in order to facilitate giving access to town hall and systems in the town hall, or giving access to their data centers. So this is a scenario where a inherent zero trust model came into play because it took into consideration that everyone's distributed today, everyone's diverse in the technologies they use today, and it was deployed where each individual application or system that different users had to access were identified and put into their own ecosystems. Ecosystems are, in our case, patented technology that's a dedicated security infrastructure you apply to an application or a use case or a project or a third party or a department, whichever way makes sense. Then, based on that, you isolate the users, devices, systems, and applications that need to interoperate as part of an ecosystem, regardless of if they're data center applications on a data center network or on a server or on a VM or a container, in a cloud instance or in a cloud VPC, or using a SaaS application. And then those are the application delivery infrastructure. And then there's the access, right? Remote user, IoT and OT, a device, a computer, a mobile phone, tablet, so on and so forth. All of these assets that needed to interoperate were associated with an ecosystem, and that ecosystem was tied to an application, a use case, or a department. And it no longer mattered what the technology was. It could have been a big belly solar garbage can, or an ATM system, or ITM, interactive teller machine, or automated teller machine, or it could be an HVAC system, just to give you an example of the IoT and OT technologies. Or it could have been a user working from home with their BYOD technology, or the traditional Linux, Windows, and Mac systems. All of these were isolated into an ecosystem, and they were able to have the connectivity they need, have the flexibility and operation they need, while continuing to implement security in a much more holistic way, and zero trust in a appropriate way. That was a government instance. Healthcare, same thing. Banking, a very similar model. Ultimately, you narrow it down, you identify your applications, use cases, or departments. You identify the users that need to interact with these applications and systems. And then it doesn't matter if it's a user or a device or a third party. Third party is another real third party risk mitigation is a huge part of this. And you allow them to interconnect, apply security holistically, isolate them, and they can function. Ultimately, regardless of industry, it comes down to those core components.
Awesome. Great explanation. So ultimately, what you gave was an example. It's more horizontal in nature than that. It's based on function, not what vertical you're in, basically.
Yeah. Ultimately, regardless. That's a great point you just made, Steve. People's way of using their applications and systems can sometimes be different. You could be on a mobile rig that does X-rays, or you could be an ATM, or you could be an HVAC unit. I'll give you a crazy instance. One of our customers, their CEO was involved in a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Their HVAC vendor connected in and drove up the CO2 levels on the floor that the negotiation was taking place off their AHUs, air handling units. And the CO2 level was up. And, it was a very unusual step for that third party to take, especially since the negotiations were remote. But the consensus was that they were trying to drive oxygen deprivation in order to impact the negotiation. So this gives you a sense of the kind of things that you need to be concerned about beyond Windows, Mac, and Linux these days. You have to worry about your air handling units and what impact they have on the CO2 levels in in a particular floor in a particular buildings.
It's not just CO2 levels. Either you could drive the temperature up and people would leave the office
Yeah,
if they were in an office at all. Great example. Great example. So another question, what regulations are relevant to zero trust?
pretty much all of them. At the end of the day, all regulations come down to you need to have documentation, you need to have visibility, you need to have control, you need to have isolation and privacy, right? And then you need to be able to facilitate incident response, right? It's very high level, but at the end of the day, it all comes back down to those things. So from a banking perspective, you have regulators, right? And they keep track of you, they manage your risk, they look at your profile. From healthcare, you have your regulations and HIPAA and some of those other things you have to adhere to. From a government perspective, especially for government vendors, you have CMMC. From a retail perspective, you have PCI. All of these all of these regulations can be significantly supported, if not have the primary functions delivered by this zero trust model. Right.
Yep.
Then you have the supplemental things like you gotta have backups, you gotta have documentations, you have to have your monitoring. But at the end of the day, the zero trust in terms of implementing isolations, implementing controls, implementing visibility, and implementing events that you can monitor and track, they all factor in.
Awesome. And I would just add the point that like the federal government is really taking a stance and trying to be a leader in implementing zero trust. We've seen a lot of executive orders come through the pipeline. We've done webinars on executive order 14028, which came out in May of 2021. We did a webinar specific to that executive order, but zero trust was a component of that and a heavy component of that, right? So a lot of the principles that are commonplace in zero trust, it was designed to protect critical infrastructure, right? And we've heard a lot about that, but many organizations are critical infrastructure, right? Like hospitals, for example, healthcare organizations. But a lot of other things are dictating zero trust now because of the premise that it's a new model, right? So you have to change the model. The old model, the perimeter-based model, doesn't work anymore. So you have to change that. So things like the federal zero trust strategy came out in 2022, I think. things like the SEC accomplishing, and um, they imparted a new privacy regulation, but there's new security controls required to meet SEC requirements, and reporting is a big part of that, right? So the SEC said if you're a public company, you have to report breaches and those kind of things. But anyway, they're heavy into zero trust, and so one of the questions I had were, what about the standards like GDPR that we know really well, and HIPAA that we know really well? What about those standards? So it sounds like that zero trust is a part of that, right?
They are. It's certainly a component of that. But I also want to touch on something you just said that sparked a thought. Um, Having gone through this exercise with many, many customers, and customers that are not just trying to implement a forward vision, customers that are actually in distress and are being forced to address the problem. The one thing that I am absolutely certain of is that you cannot deploy a viable and sustainable zero trust model with traditional security products that you probably know and love. Not that those products are bad. There's a lot of great technologies out there. They are just not suited to this task. A lot of products are out there with a focus and an emphasis of zones of trust and untrust. And zero trust is really shades of gray that it really needs to manage, not just the black and white. So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point as well.
So how would you handle, or how should the audience handle a situation like that? So if managing a shade of gray, it's not just black and white, right? So would you recommend that they contact you directly, or?
Well, we would always welcome the opportunity to speak to folks. I don't want to make this a advertisement for Acreto. We certainly have a lot of confidence in our ability to solve the problem. But the bigger point I was trying to drive, Stephen, is you need to change your mindset about security. You need to change how you look at security compared to securing these little islands that you have, be they individual clouds or offices or data centers or SaaS, into a solution that is uniform and consistent in how it applies security end to end. From the device, while securing that device, all the way to the application and everything in between, with zero potential for lateral movement, zero potential for propagation within the infrastructure. And that is something that is very, very difficult to achieve with traditional approaches. So I would encourage folks, we're always welcome to reach out to us, reach out to Stephen and connect with us. We're more than happy to have the conversation and speak to people's individual unique requirements and situation and scenarios. But at a macro level, you need to change your thinking about your tools, your security models, and how they're deployed and applied.
Awesome. Yep. Good recommendation. Thank you. So last question, what are some of the benefits and challenges of adopting a zero trust model? Start with benefits.
Well, I'll give you an outcome in terms of a benefit, is that we had high-risk customers that were not insurable by cyber insurance companies because they were too risky or were just out and out compromised with ransomware. And with a zero trust model, they were able to not only get the insurance they needed, but get the coverage they required and get it at the lowest possible price, right? So they went from being high risk and uninsurable to being insurable. Um, uh, there are obviously ways of doing it. You can do it in a way that's sustainable, or you can do it in a way that'll break your back, right? So, but the benefits are that only users, devices, systems, and applications that need to interoperate will be able to interoperate, and only at levels and with the means and methods and methodologies that are authorized, nothing else. Uh, that goes a long way to mitigating outbreaks, mitigating compromises, and all the things that goes along with it. So the benefits are the outcome, right? You're not going to get compromised. You're not going to have to get pay ransoms or have to make some hard decisions. But you have to do it in a sustainable way. The challenge is exactly that. If it's not sustainable, it'll break your back. So if you try to apply traditional security tools or one-off product-driven models, it's going to be a tough go, and it's going to be a very expensive go versus other methods that are much, much more model-wise and architecturally and structurally in tune with achieving the outcomes that you need from zero trust.
Yeah. I would add that some of the challenges are around scoping. Many of the challenges can be around scoping, right? So you have to correctly scope the initiative, and just like any initiative, start small, right? So and then expand once you get some successes behind you. But and
Well, I'll offer
budget's a
this
yeah.
to
Sorry, go ahead.
your audience here. We actually have a scoping workout exercise we go through with our customers that makes it within an hour or so. You're going to be able to really get a pretty good sense of what your requirements are scoping wise. So I didn't list that, and maybe because we've just gotten too used to that, but I agree with your comment and want to make this available to your audience if they want to go through that workout session. We can take them through it, and they will have a very, very good sense of exactly what needs to be done and in what priority.
Cool. So I want to be clear with what you're offering. Is it no cost, or is there a cost associated with that, or should anybody that wants to go through that exercise?
Yeah, they're
And
welcome. We want to make it available to everyone. We know
cool.
how challenging this exercise is for a lot of organizations, especially mid-market organizations that
Yep,
have
yep.
a lot
So if
on their.
anyone's interested in going through that exercise, just let me know via email, and I'll contact Babak and make it happen. Any closing remarks?
No, I think I've made all the points I wanted to make. I really do appreciate the opportunity to present here and speak, and really enjoyed this. Happy to have a conversation with any of your audience who feel that we could be of benefit, and again, appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Yeah, and I would highlight the conversation to understand the scoping, and just contact me if you're interested. Um, it's really hard to go through a zero trust exercise because it can be hard, right? So zero trust as a concept it can be challenging from a scoping standpoint and a budget standpoint. So just understanding what you have, what you're going to do about it, right? And those types of things can be challenging.
Okay. Stephen,
I just
if I may,
certainly.
zero trust does not have to be hard, complicated, expensive, resource intensive, or time consuming. It does not have to be that. And, I think as part of this exercise and methodologies that we have, we're more than happy to have that conversation with folks because it can be deployed quite easily without the cost and burden that people typically associate of that.
Awesome. I just wanted to real quick go through some upcoming things that are happening. So we'll have a webinar in May, June, every month, basically. We'll have a webinar, topics to be determined. So we'll make sure that you get invited, or that all the people that are to this get invited. Other activities, there's a spring security event next week, next Friday in Cleveland, Ohio. Actually, it's in Akron. It's outside of Akron. There's a medical device summit in Chicago in October, in early October. In late October, there's the information security, the big summit. Happens every year in October, the last weekend in October. I sit on the board for our ISA, and we've got a couple of events planned. One of them is in Charleston, South Carolina. So I wanted to get to some audience questions. We got a couple here. Let's see. One of the challenges in healthcare is the large number of medical devices that are either coordinated, outdated technology, or devices that can be modified. How can we secure based on these technologies?
Yeah, great question. Very common problem. A simple answer is one of the key things we've done is we've moved from operating on device or in the network or in the cloud to delivering all the security functionalities we discussed today, including zero trust, in the connection. When you're in the connection, not only can you deal with the PACS system or the ventilators or the patient monitors or infusion pumps and things like that, and be able to secure them and secure them end to end, but you can also deliver security that is always up to date without any concerns about impacting FDA approvals and things to that effect. So with security in the connection, and we can discuss exactly what that means, we can secure assets without modifying them, touching them. And a lot of times these assets are purpose-built technologies. They barely have enough juice to do what they're supposed to do, much less secure themselves. So, and they're non-standard. So the security and the connection addresses that problem in a very, very effective and sustainable manner.
Do you recommend using an ecosystem for each type of device, or how would you structure that?
It depends on the use case. So in certain scenarios where you have an imaging system, it could be an X-ray, it could be an MRI, it could be something that's much more intensive, which is the CAT scan. with just the sheer volume of images that they produce. All of those can be individually isolated, but tied back to a single ecosystem because they need to be tied to the PAC system. And then nowadays there's this trend for remote imaging support. So you have folks that are remotely connecting in, reading in images and making diagnoses based on the images. So all of those can tie back to a single ecosystem. In other cases where you have, let's say, a ventilator or a patient monitor or infusion pumps and things to that effect, they could be their own individual ecosystems, or they could be tied to an ecosystem that is tied to individual patient or patient rooms. So there's a lot of different ways
Yeah,
to
yeah.
slice
Is,
that.
is it that's something, it sounds like something that would be covered on the scoping call,
That absolutely would be. Yeah.
right?
It,
Next
it, it just
question.
depends on how customers use their environments and what their specific situation is. Yeah.
Yep. How does Acreto address a problem that we have where we have many products that each have their own operating system?
Yeah, same answer. Security and the connection. You no longer have to worry about running on the device or in the network. You could take these. The other day, I actually had the pleasure of securing a ship system for a ship where the systems, they had navigation systems, they have weather reporting systems, they have everything from IP-driven bilge pumps to steering and engine controls. All of these are purpose-built technology. So with us, we are agnostic to the operating system, and we're agnostic to the type of connection. So we've gotten our platform to work over obviously Ethernet and Wi-Fi and all of those types of things, but also satellite LTE. We've even gotten it to work over a packet radio, over on a ham radio system. So we are completely agnostic for the technology and its OS. We're completely agnostic of the type of connectivity. So this gives us a lot of flexibility to be able to deal with the purpose-built technologies, especially if they're distributed or if they're mobile.
Awesome. I'm going kind of quick because we got a lot of questions, so I'm
Oh,
trying to get to most of them. I probably won't get to all of them, but anyway, another question. What about a vendor contractor maintenance access to cloud-based VMs? The vendor will deploy patches, but the issue is because they used a shared company email address, we can't lock down with two-factor authentication.
yeah. So we deliver MFA, multi-factor authentication, as a component of every ecosystem. So because you have a dedicated ecosystem tied to an application or use case, or in this case, a third-party vendor, you can authenticate them with MFA, both email or TOTP, which will then remove the shared email scenario from the equation, and then define what level of access they have and time of access they have. You can, and by the way, third-party risk mitigation we deal with all the time because that's a huge problem that just has not had a good answer with traditional approaches. But I also want to say, any of your audience who has questions that we don't get to, we're more than happy to get online with them and respond to their questions specifically.
Cool. Couple more questions. It seems like many of the standard SaaS applications, including things like Office 365, are still having security issues. Can you secure those third-party apps?
So the answer is yes. We could control who has access to your portion of those applications. So Office 365, we can set it up so only your users will be able to log in to those SaaS applications. Anybody else who goes direct won't be able to connect or log in. So you can be very systematic and controlled in terms of who you want to have access. And if they're removed from your directory services, they will no longer be able to log in. So the answer is yes.
How is Acreto priced?
Yeah, so we are priced per ecosystem by sizing. So we have everything from the ACE 100 to ACE 10G. And it's because Acreto is unlike traditional SASE. Traditional SASE is unidirectional. A user or a device goes to an application or goes out to the internet. Acreto is a complete security infrastructure. It's bi-directional. So we charge per ecosystem and by size. And then that workout exercise will essentially determine what size ecosystem you need for each.
And by size, what you mean is by bandwidth, right? Size of
aggregate bandwidth. We do not cap bandwidth, and I was trying to stay away from bandwidth because people think that you give them a cap. You can burst to whatever capacity you have, all the way up to 100 gig. It's aggregate consumption, and it's a flat rate for the year, so there's no surprises or anything like that.
Gotcha. Thanks so much for being here, Babak. I hope the audience got something out of this, and we have some questions that we didn't get to. We'll issue responses after the fact in the follow-up email, which you're going to get. Anyway, we'll make sure that the answers to the questions that we didn't get to are included in that email. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Stephen. Thank you.
Cheers.